Good evening and welcome to an online forum on restorative justice with two candidates for District Attorney of Multnomah County. I'm your moderator, Jason Renaud. Tonight we'll meet and get to know the two men competing for the position of District Attorney of Multnomah County. Briefly, our District Attorney is responsible for prosecuting persons arrested and accused of committing state criminal law violations in Multnomah County. They also prosecute persons with mental illness to be confined until released by a hospital physician. The office manages the LEADS program. That's the new law enforcement assisted diversion program. They manage a couple of different kinds of drug court. They manage our mental health court and programs which offer diversion from prosecution for alcoholics and addicts, and also the community court and the neighborhood associations program. All in all, our district attorney is one of the most powerful and important elected positions in our community. And for the first time in a long time, your vote in this position is going to matter. The position of district attorney has been held by just two men since 1981. That's 39 years. For a little context, Billy Ray Bates was our shooting guard for the Portland Trailblazers in 1981, and Raiders of the Lost Ark was the #1 film. Frank Ivancy, a Republican, was mayor, and Vic Attia, a Republican, was governor. It was a very different time. And since 1981, there's been no substantial political challenger for the seat. Without a challenge, the incumbent district attorney alone has won race after race. This long duration without a political race, without a community-wide discussion about the prosecution of law, has itself shaped how the law is understood, administrated, and prosecuted in our community. And now in 2020, there's an open seat for the position and two well-qualified, knowledgeable, well-regarded candidates. It's time, for the first time in a long time, for the voters of Multnomah County to make a choice. Now, this forum was planned as a public community-driven event. Because of the COVID-19 and the governor's stay-at-home order, we've reformatted the forum to be online. Because the community itself can't attend, I've selected 5 questioners for the candidates. Ed Jones is a former public defender and retired Multnomah County Circuit Court judge. Jason Jones is an adjunct instructor from Portland State University's Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. Donna Sanchez is our House representative from District 43. And Joyce Harris is an educator and Black activist. Now, in 1970, Joyce co-founded the Black Education Center, a school aimed at providing elementary-age children with reading, math, and African-American cultural history. That's in 1970. Their questions are pre-recorded and have not been shown to the candidates. Now, Rabbi Ariel Stone of Congregation Shir Tikvah will frame our discussion in a moment and give us a working definition of restorative justice. The candidates have had a chance to see the rabbi's comments, and she also has a few questions. And further, for the sake of neutrality, as moderator and convener of this forum, I'd like to say I've never met these two men before last night, and for clarification, the forum is not supported or funded or created by Multnomah County or its district attorney's office. Now, some of the formality for the typical public candidate forum will be waived tonight, but the candidates have been told to keep to a specific amounts of time to their responses to questions. I hope they do, but if they don't, I will interrupt if they go beyond the time allotted. We hope to keep this forum about 2 hours in length. Now, the candidates are Ethan Knight and Mike Schmidt, and I'll let them both introduce themselves in a moment. I've also asked each candidate to provide a recorded statement from one of their own supporters to bolster and enlarge their candidacy claim. Those recorded statements will be from Dr. Elizabeth Lottie of OHSU and Casey Jama of Unite Oregon. Dr. Lottie for Ethan Knight and Casey Jama for Mike Schmidt. Now, Dr. Elizabeth Lottie is a clinical educator and hospitalist at OHSU. She is the director of narrative medicine, and where she teaches the reflective practice to interprofessional students, residents, and faculty who have a particular interest in identity formation and in resilience through story. And Casey Jama of United Oregon has been awarded the Skidmore Prize for Outstanding Young Nonprofit Professionals, the Oregon Immigrant Achievement Award, the Lowenstein Trust Award, which is presented yearly to that person who demonstrated the greatest contribution to assisting the poor and underprivileged in Portland, and the 2012 Portland Peace Prize. Quite great supporters. Now, I'd like to invite the candidates to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Ethan Knight. Ethan?
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening, and thank you, Jason, for that introduction. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ethan Knight, and I'm one of the two candidates for Multnomah County District Attorney. I'm currently an Assistant United States Attorney in Portland, and I've spent over 20 years as a state and federal prosecutor in Oregon. But let me tell you, most importantly, why I'm running and then why I think restorative justice intersects with my vision for the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. I'm running for district attorney because I love this community, and at a time of crisis when we need steady leadership to address both the challenges in the criminal justice system and the needs of those who enter and exit the criminal justice system, I believe I'm the best candidate for that job. In my over 20 years in the criminal justice system, I've confronted virtually every case and every challenge that we have, from the smallest of cases to helping build our community court program, to environmental crimes, victim crimes, including robbery and homicide. And then as a federal prosecutor, I've handled a substantial amount of public corruption, national security, domestic terrorism, international terrorism, and espionage. Beyond those credentials, though, and the time I've spent in the system, I've spent a time as well as an advocate in the legal system, as president of the Oregon Law Foundation, and a number of other roles advocating for those in the profession of law and on behalf of those who have needs for legal services. And this is all informed where we started a few moments ago. I believe that this critical function that we talked about just moments ago that serves the people of Multnomah County, that is responsible for prosecuting the roughly 10,000 cases a year that come into Multnomah County, needs to be handled in a way with foresight and care and an understanding of the system, and understanding that there are reforms that we need to make, reforms that target the needs of underserved communities, both victims and defendants, reforms that address some of the fundamental ways those who are poor come through the system, and reforms that acknowledge that some of our sentencing schemes in the past haven't worked. By that same token, by virtue of the fact I have spent considerable time in the system, I know that some things do work, that there are those in the system who do a good job, that there are things that are effective in addressing some of our unmet needs, and there are things that can be steadied and moved ahead in the coming years and months. So above all, what I bring to the position and what I hope to discuss this evening is an understanding that the role of district attorney is critical for advancing the needs of everyone in the community, not just in the criminal justice system, and that the concept of restorative justice and the notion of a needs-based practice of acknowledging there is more to the system than simply punishing or simply sentencing involves acknowledging the nuance and intricacies of the system in an effort to meet those needs. And I'm the candidate to do just that. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Ethan. Mike, how are you? How are you this evening? Ready to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And thanks for everybody who's putting this forum on and getting us together to have this critical conversation about restorative justice and the intersection of the district attorney's office. So my name's Mike Schmidt, one of the other two candidates running for this position. And I'm running because I believe that we need major reform now in our criminal justice system. My first job out of college was to be a high school teacher. And I went and did that thinking I was going to learn a lot about our education system. And I did, but what I unexpectedly learned was a lot about our criminal justice system and how in my students' lives that played out. I taught in the public schools of New Orleans, and my students didn't have the privilege that I had as an upbringing, and they had to deal with a lot of being victims of crime, witnesses to crime, sometimes children of incarcerated parents, and then every so often victim or defendants themselves. I saw how the criminal justice system had impacts on their lives and their ability to thrive. So in 2005, I moved to Portland and went to law school at Lewis and Clark, and I studied criminal law. I wanted to get into the system to be the change that I thought could happen. And I got a job at the district attorney's office where I prosecuted from 2007 to 2013, handled felony cases, drug court cases, in the mental health court, misdemeanor cases. So I did that work. And although I felt like I was helping people, I didn't feel like I was changing anything or changing the system. So in 2013, I got out. I went and worked at the legislature and then ultimately landed at the Criminal Justice Commission, a state agency that uses research and data to look at how we can improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of our criminal justice system. Ultimately, when you talk to people like our sheriff or our director of corrections, and they tell you that our prisons and our jails are the largest homeless shelters in the state. They're our largest addiction treatment facilities in the state. They're our largest mental health treatment facilities in the state. You know that what we're doing is not working. So that's why I started off this campaign with a bold 28-point plan that you can see on my website. But ultimately, the things that I'm fighting for is to have a district attorney that is going to stand up to ICE and immigration and let the communities, our immigrant communities, know that they are safe to report crimes and to call police and law enforcement, to hold police officers accountable. Police officers have a tremendous job that's really difficult, but the same laws that apply to you and me have to apply to them as well. And ultimately, we need to give people who are brought into the criminal justice system a chance to find a way out. If they've done the hard work of doing the treatment and the things that we've asked them to do after they've been convicted or served their time, we need to be there to help them remove the barriers so that they can get back on their feet and become productive members of society and not be stuck with scarlet letters that trace them and dog them for the rest of their lives so that they can't get back and doing what they need to do to live their lives happily and productively. So there are so many issues that this district attorney is going to face. And I believe that my background and experience, not only being a prosecutor, but getting out of the system and working with other system partners, gives me the perspective I need to see the bigger picture and to take and build a collaborative group. So I look forward to the conversation.
Now let's move on to get our definition of restorative justice. I've known Rabbi Ariel Stone for over 20 years and have had opportunities to turn to her for moral clarity and practical wisdom again and again, because the term of the evening is restorative justice is somewhat complex and young in its usage. It's really only been around since the early 1970s. We need a clear definition for this evening's forum. Let's hear from Rabbi Stone.
Rabbi Ariel Stone, representing Portland Interfaith Clergy Resistance, Rabbi of Congregation Shir Tikvah of Portland, Oregon. It's clear that we've reached a time in our society where we have to do what we can to address the widespread suffering that all of us see, that comes about as a result of a system that is meant to protect us and to correct us, but has come to be understood to do far too much harm. One of the approaches being considered to improve our justice system and make it more just is called restorative justice. Restorative justice sets itself up as a balance to something called a more punitive approach, and suggests that the point of justice is not to balance a scales that says an eye for an eye. Now, I come from a tradition that invented the concept of eye for an eye. It's part of the Jewish Bible. But if you look at rabbinic tradition, there is no rabbi for 2,000 years who understands that phrase, eye for an eye, the lex talionis, to actually mean an eye for an eye. The very first thing they ask in the legal deliberations is, what if the offender is blind? It's understood that what we're talking about here is measure for measure. It's easy to confuse equity and equality. It's easy to confuse correction with damage if we lose sight of the unique individuality of every person. And if we lose sight of the fact that every person is equally capable when given the right opportunities, the right support, the right instruction, to be a useful and fulfilled part of our society. It also has to be noted that prisons are not eternal. If you look back again at my particular tradition, there's no punishment that includes locking someone up. This is clearly not the only way, and it's not clear that it's the best way to correct where correction is necessary, or even to isolate when correction doesn't seem to be working. The restorative approach insists that no human being should be warehoused or forgotten. The restorative approach focuses less on the individual and more on the systems. A restorative approach doesn't say there's no harm and doesn't say there's no evil. It asks us to be smarter about the systems in which harm takes place, about the context and cause of evil. It asks us not to continue doing what we've been doing once we see that doing it isn't helping. Restorative justice focuses on establishing responsibility, not suffering simply because someone else suffered. You can't take out someone's eye just because they put out someone else's eye. It doesn't make sense. Not according to the legal tradition from which I come, for the reason I offered and for many others that they work out. What you can do is make sure that the person who harmed the other person's sight is responsible for now helping them in the situation they find themselves. If you, God forbid, put out someone's eyes, you're responsible for getting them a seeing eye dog. Where possible, restorative justice allows those who suffer to have part of a process in which they can find some healing, some return to wholeness, because they are part of a conversation by which they might point out the best way to offer a restoration for what has been broken. Where possible, for the sufferer and the one who caused the suffering to meet as human beings and work that out, not only empowers the victim, but allows for the one who caused the suffering to see some useful action to also help them achieve a certain sense that their worth as a human being is not irreparably damaged by what they have done. Our society cannot afford to lose one individual and the promise and the potential that each of us holds.
Well, holding those thoughts in mind, let's proceed to listen to our first question from the public. This will be from Joyce Harris, and I'll ask Ethan Knight to respond first and then Mike to respond second. So let's hear from Joyce Harris.
Hello, my name is Joyce Harris, and I'm on the steering committee for the Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform. We have for decades worked on issues related to police reform, justice in the criminal justice system, and community engagement. So my first question is, how will you, as the county's top prosecutor, address the racial disparities in prosecutions, sentencing, and other issues that have impacted the African American community specifically, and in other communities of color?
Ethan?
Thank you. Well, it's obviously a terrific question, and regrettably one that we get asked a lot. And I say regrettably because it underscores how pervasive the problem is. And because the problem of racial inequity in the system is so pervasive, my view really is that it's like a chronic disease. And viewing it that way, we really need a multifaceted approach. And so here's what I think about and what I talk about based on my experience in the system. First, we need to think about outside the criminal justice system first, being advocates, for dealing with the inequities that often follow someone before and after they ever get into the criminal justice system, and addressing some of those structural and institutional inequities. The next piece is on the sentencing front, tracking data and doing a better job to ensure that there's parity for the things that the district attorney can control. And that includes making recommendations that are equal and effectively neutralize the factor of race in that decision. The next piece is ensuring that the office itself, in making those decisions, more accurately and fairly represents and reflects the community which it represents. And that means ensuring that there's diversity amongst the prosecutors in the office. And that means doing a better job in hiring. And I did a lot of work on that issue as vice president of the Oregon State Bar and continuing to push for diversity amongst the bar at large. But that's something we need to do a better job, particularly in Portland, Oregon, quite frankly. And I think that'll have an impact. The other piece is doing a better job long-term about thinking about the relationship of law enforcement to the community. I mean, this obviously, as the question alludes to, has been something folks have been working on a long time. But like any chronic condition, you need to continue working on it. And that means trying again to build those trusting relationships between different pieces of the community, between law enforcement and minority communities who have a history of dealing with inequities in the system and inequities in policing. And lastly, I'll say, and this circles back to the role of the district attorney in getting into those charging decisions, and that is being willing to acknowledge, when confronted with best practices, confronted with data, and confronted with the changes in society and culture, that the things we may have done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and the information we may have relied on in the past are not always accurate. And let me give an example. If there was a period of time 20, 30 years ago, even 15 or 10, when we thought mandatory drug sentences, particularly in the federal system, were a fair and appropriate way to deal with that type of crime. But we know now, of course, that's had a disproportionate impact on the African-American community and on the system as a whole. And acknowledging things like that is the only way we can constructively change in the long term.
Thanks, Ethan. Mike, would you answer Joyce Harris's question?
Yeah, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've actually been working on ever since I left prosecution. And so, the way that I've approached it, so to know how I will approach it as DA, I'll tell you how I have approached it in my job as the director of the Criminal Justice Commission. What I've done is we've looked at the data and the research. I read a book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. And that book, as many of the viewers are probably aware, details how the war on drugs has had a really disproportionate impact on minority communities in this country. And so what we did is, after reading that book, I had everyone in my agency read it. And then we looked at and saw, okay, that's a national story. What's the Oregon story? And we looked at Oregon data. And what we found was consistent with what we saw in the national story, which was that with decades of data from SAMHSA collecting who uses drugs in our community, the data says that we all, no matter what your race or ethnicity, use drugs at very similar rates. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, we use the drugs at very similar rates, between 1% and 3% of our subpopulations. We took that and overlaid it with criminal justice data. We looked at arrests, we looked at convictions. And as the author in The New Jim Crow pointed out, we saw a lot of disparity. African Americans and Native Americans in Oregon were disproportionately, but sometimes 5 to 8 times as great as white people being arrested and convicted for possession of controlled substance. I took that information and I brought together a coalition of stakeholders. I worked with the Attorney General, with Unite Oregon, with Latino Network, with the sheriffs and the chiefs of police. We looked at the data and we made recommendations to the legislature on how to change the law. And I'm happy to report, after that law has been in place for almost 3 years now, we've seen disparity for felony convictions across this state drop precipitously. It's had a major impact on changing the disparity for Black and Native communities. I'm extremely proud of that work. So I tell you that because that is exactly what you can expect from me as district attorney, to work with community organizations, to work with law enforcement partners, to work with legislators, and to make the data open and transparent so that people can actually see what's going on in the system. And then from there, decide what are the best ways to tackle those things. Sometimes it's going to be policy changes. Sometimes it's going to be law changes. But that is what you can count on from me, is to be data-driven and then to look at where the disparity is and then call it out and speak truth to power and say, this needs to change. It's not just. And that's what I plan to do as district attorney.
Thanks, Mike. That's our first question from Joyce Harris. Let's go on to the second question from my friend, Ed Jones. And we'll roll tape and Ed will introduce himself and ask his first question. And we'll have Ethan answer the question first.
I'm Edward Jones. I was a trial court judge for 18 years. When I retired in 2017, I was the chief criminal judge in Multnomah County. Multnomah County's Juvenile Services Division endorses restorative justice, which it describes as bringing those who have harmed, those who've been harmed, and the community together to repair the harm. Why aren't these principles applied in the adult criminal justice system?
Ethan, want to take a whack at that?
Absolutely. So the question is, why haven't the principles as articulated by Judge Jones been applied to the adult system in the same manner they have to the juvenile system? And I guess I've got a two-part answer. One, the systems and the offenders are different. And two, to some degree, they should both be applied equally to each system. And let me answer and address sort of those salient points as I see them. The first is, the juvenile system we've always viewed differently, and rightly so, because juvenile offenders are different. I mean, I think the recent legislative changes with respect to Measure 11 underscore that point, that cognitively juvenile offenders are different, and they're at a different stage in their life where they are amenable to treatment and to forms of sanction that put them in, frankly, a different place where there is a better chance we can reduce recidivism. So I think it's always been a more amenable population to restorative justice. And I've certainly seen that both anecdotally and statistically in the time I've handled serious adult cases over the year and examined, thousands of reports detailing criminal histories and what interventions are typically more effective. So that's why we've, embraced restorative type reforms in the juvenile system and not the adult system. Now, the second answer I gave, which is, we should look at incorporating that underlying goal of restorative justice in the adult system. And I don't see incorporating that goal as being mutually exclusive with other forms of punishment that may be necessary. I mean, incapacitation or deterrence when appropriate. But we need to do a better job of incorporating the principles of restorative justice in the adult system. And so I think, the last piece of that then becomes the why, and then it becomes the how. How would we better incorporate those principles? I think having a more robust opportunity for victims to confront defendants in the adult system, and not just confront in a confrontational sense, but to work toward those restorative goals that sort of are the guiding principles of restorative justice. That's one way to do it. I think having a more needs-based approach for both victims and others who come into the system that acknowledges their unmet needs that can't be addressed by sentencing alone. We've gotten better at dealing with that in the juvenile system, and frankly, with lower level adult offenses as well. I mean, that was one of the guiding principles for the community court program when it was originally enacted 20 years ago. So that is how we best do that. So again, to recap, I think juvenile offenders are different, but I think we need to do a better job of incorporating those principles in the adult system. And I think we can do that by emphasizing the needs of victims and others in the system and trying to impose the principles of restorative justice.
Well, thanks, Ethan. Mike, you want to take a whack at that question by Judge Jones?
Yeah. So, I mean, the question that the judge asked was, why has this not happened in the adult system? And, I'll just answer that directly. I think that restorative justice is not well understood, and that among law enforcement professionals, it's seen as a soft on crime type response. That's really unfortunate. And I think that the next district attorney of Multnomah County has their work cut out for them, both to convince their own deputies and law enforcement and community members and victims that not only is restorative justice, does it hold the promise to get better results, better public safety results, but it can actually help us get more accountability than somebody just being sent away and having to do time on their own. And just a quick, anecdote about that. I've done a lot of talking to folks in the community about restorative justice, and I've learned a lot over the course and even before this campaign, but certainly over the course of the campaign. And I've come to realize that restorative justice is really a philosophy. And what it has made me think about is when I was a little kid and my parents, me and my sister are wailing on each other or something like that. And so what was the worst punishment that my parents could inflict upon me? It wasn't to send me to my room. It was to make me hug my sister and say, tell your sister that you love her. That was the hardest thing for me to do. That was what I did not want to do. I would have more than happily been sent to my room and been mad at my parents and the injustice of the situation and how unfair the world is. But my parents were smart and they employed restorative justice, as I'm sure many of our parents do. And they said, no, you got to apologize. You have to make it right. And then give your sister a hug and tell her you love her. That's the painful work of accountability. And the way our criminal justice system is set up is it's actually set up to not achieve that. It's set up to keep people separate. And in talking to a lot of victims, I think that we could do a lot better for them and helping them meet their needs of what they need to heal if the person who did the harm is held accountable in a meaningful way that actually helps the victim get back to where they were or heal as much as they can. So I think that the reason to the judge's question is because, frankly, we're behind the times. I think that we should be embracing restorative justice. It has been applied to juveniles. There's a disconnect there because juveniles can be in our juvenile system from, the age of, 14 to 25. But if you're charged with a crime at 18, you're in the adult system. We should immediately be looking at that 18 to 25-year-old group whose brains are still developing. And even expanding it beyond that. So I think this is going to be a real challenge for the next DA to embrace this, but it's one that we should take on.
Thanks, Mike. Now let's go on and hear again from Rabbi Ariel Stone. She has a question for both of you. And Ethan, you'll answer first again.
First, I'd like to ask you about your view of your responsibility to those communities who have felt the impact of the criminal justice system. For example, families of those who are imprisoned.
The district attorney and a prosecutor is responsible for enforcing and upholding the rule of law and for doing everything in an ethical and appropriate manner. To be clear about the role of the district attorney versus other folks in the system, the district attorney and a district attorney, deputy district attorney, can't even have contact with a defendant or members of his or her family. So it's important to understand what those roles and parameters are when I sort of frame my answer to this question. Having said that, I think there is a broader responsibility of a prosecutor to, again, act in an ethical and an appropriate manner and make decisions that are sound in the interest of the community. And part of making those decisions is to do so in a way that reduces the impact or the harm on anyone in the system or anyone in the process. Including, the families of those who may be incarcerated. But I'll say primarily, that is the responsibility also of the person who is sentenced to take care of their family and to be mindful of those responsibilities. And that's often lost in the system as well. But I think what we need to do a better job, and this question, I think, hints at the edges of this, is focusing on reentry for those who come through the criminal justice system. Because when we talk about responsibility for those who are in the system and for those who go to prison and their families, we often forget about the importance of reentry. And that means doing a better job with probation and parole in ensuring that folks, when they come out of the system, are not burdened by convictions if they follow the rules and done everything they should. We need to do a better job with expungements. We need to do a better job of mitigating the effects of financial judgments against defendants who come out of the system. So there are things that can be done. But I think at the end of the day, the broader responsibility for a prosecutor is to make the best decisions for everyone in the system involved and not view each prosecution in a vacuum. And that means when enforcing the law, to take into consideration everyone who walks through that courtroom. And that may be relatives of the victims, and it may be relatives of the defendant, but first and foremost, it's the community.
Great, thanks, Mike. Excuse me, Ethan. And now, Mike, can you answer the question?
Yeah. So I do think that there's a responsibility of the next district attorney to take this on and understand how the decisions of that office impact everybody in our community. And, you know, it really goes back actually to one of the things I said in my opening statement about what I first saw as a high school teacher. I saw how my students' lives were impacted when one of my students had to spend a weekend in solitary confinement. I saw what that did to his ability to come back and be a student. I saw what it was like for my students whose parents were in jail or in prison and weren't there to help them do their homework at night, or what that even did to their psyche in terms of what they thought their prospects in life were likely to be when I asked them if they wanted to go to college. So I think that there is a responsibility for the prosecutor to understand that the decisions that we make, everybody in our community should be taken into account. So I'll give you an example of a program that I've worked on at the state level. It's called Family Sentencing Alternative Program. We actually took it from Washington State. And what we saw was that people who were bound to go to prison, they had committed a crime that was a prison sentence crime. But instead of giving them a prison sentence, they were given wraparound services with the family unit. And so the people that were targeted were people that were the caregivers of dependent children, so that we weren't creating yet another circumstance in our system where children would have to enter the foster care system or go to some other adult caretakers, but keep the family unit together and use wraparound services that include parenting classes. And what we've seen in Washington State, it's been robustly studied. And in Oregon, we've been doing it now for, I believe, around 5 years. And we've seen that the recidivism rates of people who have participated in that program compared to their peers are down by 17%. So not only did we get better public safety results, we were able to keep families together. And I think that's the kind of thing that the next district attorney should be looking at, trying to think about, hey, the decisions that I make are going to have consequences beyond just this incident that's happening that's before us in the courtroom. But I have to think about immigration consequences. I have to think about family consequences, communities that have been disenfranchised because of decades and even centuries of systems that have been designed to oppress them. You know, how can we make sure that we're not disproportionately perpetuating a lot of that going forward? So I think the district attorney has a huge role and a responsibility to the community to look at things that can mitigate the harm the criminal justice system that can do.
Thanks, Mike. Now we'll go on to yet another question, this time from Jason Jones, adjunct instructor from Portland State University.
I'm Jason Jones, a criminal justice professional and educator based in Portland, Oregon. What specifically are the limitations of restorative justice applications for prosecutors in the district attorney's office?
Thank you. You know, it's an important question because I think it underscores many of the challenges the next district attorney or any district attorney faces in dealing with restorative justice or other programs or aspirational goals that really fall outside of the scope of the district attorney's office. There may be policy objectives or other areas that we can do little about. You know, I think the limitations, unfortunately, really relate to what we can do when someone leaves the system. In other words, by law, when the judgment's entered on a case, the district attorney or the prosecutor in the case does not have a bigger role or any role by law in the case anymore. So that means for restorative justice to work effectively, prosecutors have to do everything they can to address the needs of the victim and other folks in the system while that case is still in court. And so that really is what I see to be the primary limitation. It's what can we do and when can we do it? And so when we talk about perhaps ways to address that limitation or those needs, we need to do a better job first of involving our law enforcement professionals in the process and not walling them off. For example, with sex crimes in particular, police officers and detectives can work with victims advocates to begin the healing process and the restorative process early on. That's also true for other types of crimes as well. So we need to find ways to work with defense attorneys and to bring that restorative process to a quicker start in the system, so it's not simply limited by the quick few court appearances before the person may be done. So it's really expanding that timeline as the way to deal with the limitations of restorative justice in the system. And so lastly, I think in having identified what some of the limitations are, we need to talk about opportunities outside of the formal litigation process to help address restorative justice. And that may mean bringing in the Department of Community Justice and Probation with victims advocates who may work in the DA's office. That may mean working more efficiently and effectively with nonprofits who have an understanding of restorative justice. And it may mean that we expand the role of the Victims Fund and victim services to go beyond the litigation process. And it may mean ultimately on the restorative end that we do a better job of bringing defense attorneys in to ensure that defendants, as part of the restorative process, can be engaged after their cases are complete. Because again, all this speaks to the fact that restorative justice is not a quick, finite act. It's part of a long timeline that meets the needs of all the parties involved. So we need to do a better job of expanding that timeline.
Thanks, Ethan. Mike?
So I think one of the big limitations that the next district attorney is going to face in wanting to implement more restorative justice programs is really going to be one of resource and what doesn't really exist in our community. The volume of cases that the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office handles is on the magnitude of 10,000 plus a year. So a lot of those types of cases might be cases that are exactly the type of case that we could set up a restorative process in the community. But those resources are not there right now as we speak. So I think there is opportunity for a DA to think creatively and say, we would like to do something that is outside of the system. But we're really going to need investment and a lot of focus on building up community resources, getting people trained to participate in this, all those kinds of things. I've talked to folks at Resolutions Northwest. I know that we do have professionals in our community. There's the RJCO, which is the Cooperative of Oregon, the Restorative Justice Cooperative of Oregon. There are professionals in our community that are willing and ready to help educate more people and bring more people into this. But quite frankly, it's not built up to the level that it needs to be for the next DA to start on day one and really think about embracing restorative practices. So what that's going to mean is that you're going to need an advocate in the district attorney's office that is willing to take some risks in terms of thinking of what cases could be handled that way, and then slowly kind of grow and hopefully build that demand in the community for more investment into those types of resources. And you do that by trying things, piloting them, and then checking the outcomes, making sure that we're getting the public safety results that the community needs, that victims, their needs are being met, that it's being a successful program. But ultimately, there's a lot of building to be done that just isn't, the infrastructure is not there right now because, quite frankly, our system has not embraced restorative justice to a large extent. Ethan brings up the point of leaving the courtroom and going to the custody of DOC. That's absolutely another factor in terms of the district attorney's role. You can do some things like potentially build into plea agreements, whether or not participation in a restorative process gives you any future benefits. But really, that is another challenge. There are some places that have done some things statutorily to allow district attorneys' offices to retake jurisdiction of some cases. Washington State passed a statute similar to that. So there's some things we could do, but right now that doesn't exist either. So that would have to be another thing that we looked at for system changes.
Okay, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Ethan. We have got one more question in our first round, and that will come from Tawana Sanchez. We'll hear her introduction, her first question, and then get the first answer from Ethan and the second answer from Mike.
My name is Tana Sanchez. I am the state representative for House District 43 and in North and Northeast Portland, and I am also the Director of Family Services for the Native American Youth and Family Center. How would you, as district attorney, look at the issue of disproportionate numbers of communities of color in the criminal justice system?
Ethan, very similar question to Joyce, but slightly different. Let's hear your answer.
Well, again, an important question because it gets at, I think, one of the most significant challenges faced by the criminal justice system. And at the risk of repeating myself to some degree, I want to talk again about really what I see as the need for a multifaceted approach, talking about, the disproportionate representation of minorities in the system. And the need really to approach it with an eye toward all the different inputs in the system and the actors in the system in the hope of moving the needle and get away from the idea that you can make one isolated change and expect a different outcome, have one committee convene and expect a different outcome. Because I think to some degree that's been the approach we've embraced in the past and it's been well intended, but it hasn't really, I think, embrace the notion that I talked about earlier, that this is really a chronic disease. And to, deal with it once and for all, we need, many different approaches. So again, I'll emphasize those because I think they're important. The first, again, is what the district attorney can control directly. And that is, of course, looking at sentencing outcomes and disproportionate representation in the system of minorities and people of color. And when you look at those numbers, what can you do? And can you ensure there is some parity in the plea bargaining and the sentencing phase? So those are the points when you look at the racial and ethnic disparity report that was generated by the standing committee that addressed this issue. They talked about 7 different points in the system, 2 of which can be controlled by the district attorney directly. So what are those points and can they be controlled and what can we do to move the needle? Then again, to step back, we need to do a better job of course, ensuring that folks in law enforcement and the district attorney's office better represent those communities which and who they serve. And that's a hiring choice. But again, I want to get back to, I think, the first point I made on the earlier question. And that is, I think when we talk about, the history of disparity in the criminal justice system, and that's a discussion, I've been a party to for years and, been on committees and talked about solutions. I think there is often a failure to recognize when we had that discussion about the institutional inequities that exist throughout, our society and our system. And that means, by the time a criminal defendant may get to the system or even a victim, they may have been discriminated against applying for a home loan, at school, applying for a job, at all these different points. So unless we sort of view this more as a larger societal issue and not simply in the context of the criminal justice system, I think we'll miss an opportunity. So I certainly would like to reiterate, the solutions I talked about earlier, and again, go back to that larger picture that inequity does not just exist in the criminal justice system, it's everywhere, and we need to fight it everywhere.
Thanks, Ethan. Mike?
I think, the first time the slightly different iteration of this question, I talked a lot about data and the story of how we use data to change our laws in this state, to change disparity for felony drug convictions. I think a big part of that story, though, was where it started, which was looking at reading the book, right? Looking at the research that was done by a scholar. I think that's a thing that the next district attorney can do, is to bring some of those outside sources in terms of continuing legal education into the deputies so that they can be exposed to what is the research saying. But then even more than that, even that research was predicated on community experience. And throughout this race, I've worked with groups who are supporting me, like the Latino Network and Unite Oregon and Pano and others. I look forward to continuing those relationships because I've been through many legislative committee hearings where people are up there and testifying and talking about their experience of having somebody, getting pulled over for driving while black. And then describe exactly what happens in that situation when a taillight gets poked out that wasn't, to the driver's knowledge, previously broken. I think there's a lot of stories and experiences that we need to bring into it. I'm a very quantitative type person. I love data. I love the research. I'm going to be, making the office data transparent, putting it on dashboards for people to use. But one of the things that I've learned in my experience doing that at the Criminal Justice Commission is it's not a substitute. It really has to be coupled and paired with the qualitative experience of the community and hearing from them firsthand. What are the stories? How are their lives? How have they been impacted? And what are the things that they would like to see change? So I think whoever the next district attorney is going to have a tremendous responsibility to build those relationships and bring people who have not traditionally been involved in looking at the policies of the district attorney's office, but seeing, are we really achieving the goals that we intend to achieve with these policies? Or can we achieve public safety, but do it in a way that perhaps is not having negative impacts on communities and bringing disproportionate communities of color into the criminal justice system? So really, it's both the quantitative, the data side, which is something I look forward to doing, but pairing it with the community and bringing in the community voice to be a piece and to be there to represent their experience.
Thanks, Mike. And that ends round one. Now we're going to take a little break, have a little fun, go a little more quickly, and ask 50 questions of each of these men in just a few minutes. These are questions we're going to keep to just yes or no answers. The purpose of this is to get to know them not as attorneys, not as prosecutors, not as elected officials, but just as people, just people. So we'll just go quickly. We'll have 50 questions, and we'll start each of them just yes or no, and we'll start each of them. Mike Schmidt will answer first, and Ethan will answer second. We'll see those questions on the screen. So first question, cats or dogs? Mike?
Dogs.
Ethan?
Dogs.
Salt or pepper?
Salt.
Salt.
We're not keeping score here, guys. Number 3, ducks or beavers?
Ducks.
Oh, ducks.
Do you think the United States is a racist country?
Yes.
The country? No.
Should vaping products be legal?
No.
No.
Have you ever had to run from the police?
Yes.
Do campus police count?
Yes.
No comment.
Did you go to school in Portland?
No, North Carolina.
And Mike, did you go to school in Portland?
Lewis and Clark. Yes.
Rock music or country music? Mike first.
Rock.
Ethan?
Rock.
Can you change the oil in your own car?
It's a Prius. Probably not.
Ethan?
No. I mean, not if I want it to work.
Are you fluent in another language, Mike?
No.
Ethan?
Unless you count that 4 years of Latin, no.
Okay, next question. Have you ever had a felony committed against you?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you know how to play a musical instrument, Mike?
A steel pot? No.
No.
Mike, have you ever climbed Mount Hood?
No.
Ethan?
Nope.
Now, Mike, do you get things done by the deadline or long before?
Deadline?
Ethan?
Deadline.
Mike, when you were growing up, did you want to be a lawyer?
No.
How about you, Ethan?
Yes.
Okay, here's one. Do you believe in God?
Yes.
Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, have you ever seen someone die?
Not at the moment, no.
Ethan?
I'm hesitating because I've seen lots of dead bodies. I don't
Seen someone
think,
die.
I don't think so.
Mike, do you love the holidays?
Yeah.
How about you, Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, do you have a sweetheart?
I do.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, do you consider yourself artistic?
I do.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, did you know your father well?
Yes.
How about you, Ethan?
Yes.
Again, we're not keeping score. It's not a psychological test. Mike, have you been to Sweat Lodge?
No.
And Ethan?
No.
For yourself, Mike, would you rather be judged by a judge or a jury?
We'll go jury.
Ethan?
Jury.
Mike, is it hard for you to accept compliments?
No.
How about you, Ethan?
Increasingly not.
Mike, when you meet someone for the first time, are you good at remembering their names? It's campaign time.
Getting better, but no, not great.
How about you, Ethan?
No.
Mike, do you have a person, a friend who's a person of color, a person you talk with, say, at least once a week?
Yeah.
How about you, Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, have you ever tried to be a vegetarian?
Yes.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, can you ride a horse?
Technically, yes.
And Ethan, can you ride a horse?
I have, but I don't think I can.
Okay. Mike, I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask anyway. Mike, do you have children?
I do. 2 of them.
And Ethan, do you have children?
Yes, two.
How old are your children, Ethan?
13 and 15.
Okay. And Mike, has anybody in your family ever been to prison?
Yes.
And Ethan, anyone in your family been to prison?
No.
Mike, have you traveled in a third world country?
Yes.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, have you ever had a family member who had a severe and persistent mental illness?
Yes.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Mike, have you ever fired anyone for cause?
No.
How about you, Ethan?
No.
Do you plan to continue as district attorney the grand jury review of the jail? Mike?
Yes.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Good. Will you continue to release the transcripts for lethal use of force by police, Mike?
Yes.
And Ethan?
Yes.
Thank you. Mike, have you ever had no money at all?
I could always call my parents, so I guess I'll say no.
How about you, Ethan?
Probably the same boat. I've had no money, but I knew there were people I could call.
Mike, have you ever been to powwow?
I don't think so.
How about you, Ethan? Powwow? Mike, are you a veteran?
No.
And Ethan,
No.
did you serve? No. Mike, is anyone in your family first or second generation immigrant?
No.
And Ethan?
No.
Mike, has anyone in your immediate family been on food stamps or Medicaid?
No.
Ethan?
No.
Question. Last question. Have you ever been in the hospital overnight, Mike?
Yes.
How about you, Ethan?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that was very illuminating, at least to me. And we'll go on now to more questions from our public questioners.
The next question that I'd like to pose to the candidates is, how will you, in your role as district attorney for Multnomah County, address the issues of mistrust that have existed in those communities for quite a long time by engaging with those communities and being transparent about how your office operates and how it makes decisions? And finally, how will you be responsive to those communities when there are issues that come up?
I think it's a good question, Mike. What do you think?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a great reason why we have campaigns and contested elections. And this has been a great opportunity for Ethan and myself to get out and start building, meeting people and building those connections and networks. I think that's going to be a big key for me, is continuing on a lot of those relationships. But to get back to the premise of the question, which is, how are you going to work on the mistrust that exists between the community and law enforcement? And I think there are so many different ways to go about this. One, I think, is transparency. I'm very excited, like I've done at the state level, to put and make dashboards, make the work of the district attorney's office available to anybody 24/7 on our website. It's something that I've been able to do at the state level for criminal justice data, and it's not something that's been done across the country in district attorney's offices. So it's not just a criticism of Multnomah County's DA's office, but district attorney's offices are traditionally known as black boxes of information. And so I think that's one way that we can start to be more transparent about who's coming into our system, and then the decision points, charging decisions, and then when you get to resolution of the case, and then convictions, plea bargains, and moving on from there, making that data transparent. And I think, quite frankly, based on data that I've seen, in some ways the community would be pleasantly surprised once that data becomes public and transparent and out there. And in some ways it's going to highlight things that the community probably already knew existed, and we need to do a deeper dive and work on. So data absolutely is one of the ways to be transparent. Building the coalition that I've built in this election with some of the groups that I've already named, I already have a working relationship with them from my time in the Criminal Justice Commission. I intend to continue that. One of the first things that I would want to do if elected would be to go through the office policy manual and to go, unit by unit, the way that we handle cases, and look at it with a community lens of people that come in and talk about, how these policies have impacted their communities over the years, and see if there aren't things that we could change from a policy perspective in the district attorney's office. But I think having the voices of the community at that conversation, and people who have been impacted by those policies is going to be crucial. And so, I think it's just going to be a continuing conversation with some of the coalitions that I've already built throughout this campaign, and then merging that with increasing transparency of who is going through our system and what outcomes we're achieving.
Thanks, Mike. Ethan, can you answer Joyce Harris's question about mistrust?
Absolutely. And I think, the starting point for my answer to the question is the beginning of the question, which is mistrust, and how do you address it? And how do you think about what that means? And I can talk about specific ways to increase transparency and engagement, because of course, those were other components of the question. But when you talk about mistrust in any relationship, I think the key piece is trying to rebuild that trust at the front end. And that involves really listening and acknowledging the basis for the mistrust. Over the years, I think what I've seen a lot of is sort of a passive or kind of half-hearted acknowledgement of why there's mistrust between law enforcement and communities of color and other communities, without really listening to the basis of that, without really stopping to understand what it's like to be in a position where you feel like you're either powerless or you haven't been listened to continually. And so I think the first piece of that is trying to listen and be aware. It doesn't mean you always agree, but trying to engage communities who've been marginalized and trying to involve them in the process. So then that gets to the three specific points of the question. The first, being more engaging. That's a key piece of any relationship I think an elected official, particularly a district attorney, needs to have, and it's to use the existing structures and to expand those community relationships. And then the next piece, of course, is being transparent. We can do that with officer-involved shootings, but it also involves being transparent with the data that Mike's alluded to, but I talked about in the answers about racial disparities in the system, ensuring that there's parity in that data that relates to how we're treating everyone in the system is available for people to see, because that helps, I think, get to that core trust issue. And the last piece of the question really was about responsiveness. And that goes to trust and mistrust as well. I think that, part of being, trusted is having, leaders and institutions that are responsive to everyone equally. And, I'm a big believer in wanting people to have faith in institutions and they should believe in them. But to do that, you have to be responsive. And if people don't feel like they have a voice, you don't get very far. So, what I see my role is as a district attorney is to do a better job of being simply present in the community, helping to listen, helping to bridge that gap, and helping to be more responsive. So when we encounter those difficult times, when there are situations with law enforcement in the community, it's not the first time that I'm there or members of my office are there, that those relationships are nurtured and sustained for a long period of time.
Thanks, Ethan. Now let's go on and hear the next question from Judge Ed Jones.
Could you tell us about a situation in which you were able to apply restorative justice principles in your work?
Mike, can you answer Judge Jones' question?
Let's see. In my work, I'm going to pivot slightly and apply it in my daily life. I was, I don't know, several months ago now, I walked out to the curb and saw that my car had some fresh damage on it. And, that was a bummer. And I called the insurance company and I started all that process and so on and so forth. But then after I had come back for the day, I saw another car parked on my street that also had fresh damage on it. And it appeared to me that the paint from that car matched the paint that was now streaked on my car. And I knew who was driving the car. And so I walked up to the house, and the gentleman whose car it was sitting there. And I said, hey, I see that my car seemed to be hit this morning. And, I noticed there's some damage on your car. And after a little bit of back and forth, and a little bit of denial, we worked out a solution, a resolution. I had to pay a deductible to get the damage fixed. And because, I had now figured out who did the damage, I was paying the full deductible on that. And so I'd said, hey, you need to make this right for me and cover that expense. And so, even though there wasn't a full accounting or accountability for that, he made good on that. And we handled it over the course of several months, and him making installment payments to me to cover my deductible. So, I mean, that's just a situation in my real life that happened not too long ago where, instead of engaging, which I certainly could have, and called the police and gone through what so many people rightfully would do, I decided to engage the person, and that's part of my privilege as a white male who's taller than average, that I feel comfortable enough doing that. But we worked out a resolution that was sufficient, and I think we both ended up being better off for handling it that way.
Thanks, Mike. Ethan, can you answer Ed Jones's question?
Sure. I've got two examples that take me back to my time in the district attorney's office when I think about the principles of restorative justice in my job and when they've been applied. And the first involved a vehicular homicide case I handled. And of all of the violent crime and cases I prosecuted, in some ways those vehicular homicide, and that means someone who's been charged with a crime for killing someone with their car, usually a drunk driver, were some of the most challenging because there was a randomness to those crimes that just took the families aback in a way and with a kind of sadness I rarely saw in other cases. And there was one in particular where it was, someone with no criminal record had killed somebody else while extremely drunk. And they were sentenced. We got to a resolution that was appropriate, but it was clear to me, having worked with the victim's family throughout the process, that there was something missing. And when we finished that process, I stayed in touch with them and helped sort of talk through the mundane pieces of the case and the process with them afterwards, and got them in touch with victim services. But I think it was cathartic for both of us to try and put together what had happened in a way that was restorative beyond that prison sentence. And I'm not going to use the names, but I remember that distinctly. And the next was I was in a Stadium Fort Myer grocery store about 14 years ago, and a woman came up to me in the aisle and said, "Well, do you recognize me?" And I said, "Sorry, I don't." And she said, "Well, I was a juror on the aggravated murder case you tried about a month ago that had gone on for about 2 months. And of course, with the jurors, you're not right up in front of them. And it was an extraordinarily horrendous case, mutilated bodies, rape, torture." And she said to me, the case was over. And so in my mind, that's it. And this was a juror, so somebody else in the process. She goes, "Well, thank you for your work. It was a good case. It was handled well." She goes, "I've been in therapy for, it would have been 2 months, the 2 months since the trial." And it occurred to me, and I didn't think about it, at age 30 in the terms of restorative justice. What I thought about was how remarkable it was that this person was so impacted by the system when I only saw it as cases and process and litigation and on to the next one. And this woman is crying, describing the therapy she's in for what the system had done and not complaining about her role as a juror. And so when we got into this campaign and I thought about the needs of people in the system, I thought about her and that, the importance of recognizing that trauma is a piece of the system for everyone who's involved. And we can't lose sight of that or we'll lose our humanity in the system.
Thank you, Ethan. Now we'll go on to a question from the Rabbi Ariel Stone.
I'm also interested in your views on challenges to convictions where there is evidence of innocence or prosecutorial misconduct.
So Mike, prosecutorial misconduct.
Yeah, well, we've talked a lot about building trust with the community and legitimacy and the challenges that the criminal justice system has and does currently face with that trust relationship. And prosecutorial misconduct is absolutely not tolerable because, not only is it wrong in the instant case where, our role is to seek justice. It's not to win, it's to have a just outcome. But so it's wrong in the instant case, but it is that damage and it will continue to perpetuate the damage and the mistrust between the community and the prosecutor's office if it's not handled. one of the things that, I would love to do, and I think we are going to be going into budgetary times that are probably unprecedented. But one of the things that I would love to do is have an integrity unit in the office. And there's some of that now, but I think it really needs to be made more robust. That would work with groups like the Innocence Project when they bring up cases where they have real concerns and where they want to see things be tested for DNA evidence, for example, and working with them to be collaborative to get testing of old cases to make sure that justice was done. Because look, even when we are doing our best and everybody has the best intentions and nobody's trying to do the wrong thing, mistakes can be made. And I think that we just all have to acknowledge that that's the case and be open when somebody else brings a legitimate claim and be open that the evidence could, if examined again, lead us in another way. So having that unit in the office that is willing to work with partners like that at the Innocence Project to see if we can objectively look at those cases again. I think to do that, to do it right, you would really want to have a unit who handles just that works on those kind of integrity type cases that would hopefully be a little bit insulated from the rest of the office, because I think there is an internal pressure that can apply, especially if the original attorney who worked on that case is still in the office, to not dig into those cases. So you need to have a strong leader who's going to make sure that there is that kind of walled off aspect to that unit where prosecutors can actually look at cases. I think we also need to be open to the idea that the science has changed. There's a lot of research out there and literature written on forensic evidence and what has changed over time. And if there are cases that have been decided on evidence that is no longer reliable in the scientific community, we should be looking at those cases as well. So I think this is a crucial area where the DA can help build back the legitimacy and the trust of the community.
Thanks, Mike. Ethan, would you answer the question?
Absolutely. So obviously, institutional trust is sort of, to me, the key piece of an answer to the question. And when we talk about, examining prosecutions and ensuring that they are indeed appropriately brought or based if there are questions about their legitimacy. So, I mean, for starters, I've got significant background in this as someone who's prosecuted public corruption cases. But on the legal side, I'm intimately familiar with the processes used to evaluate post-conviction, convictions, how they're managed, how they're handled, and the best way to challenge them. And the other piece is, of course, we need to ensure that there's a robust and transparent litigation process. The best way to ensure that the rights of everyone have been preserved in the process is to ensure that there's adequate representation on both sides and there's transparency. And that's why I've been a long-standing advocate for pay parity between prosecution and criminal defense lawyers like we have in the federal system, and ample support for indigent defense and criminal defense services, so that when those challenges are made, defendants have the representation they need to make them, because the statutes exist to challenge convictions. And let me speak to the conviction integrity piece of this. There is a deputy DA now who handles conviction integrity, and I've talked a fair amount with the folks at the Innocence Project over the years. The DA's office is generally responsive. They're overwhelmed. So I think really the thing we need to think about too is ensuring that there are enough resources on the defense side to bring those challenges if they're merit-based, and to be able to support the interests of defendants who believe that a prosecution may be based on faulty evidence or faulty facts, because nobody wants that in the system. And I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that if there are questions, they're properly vetted in the process. And the other way to do that too, I mean, if you want to address the concern Mike has about somebody in the office being too close to the case, the way that's handled is not internally then, it's through another office. That's a proper basis for recusal for an examination of a case, or you go through the state attorney general's office in the post-conviction litigation section if you really need to wall it off or examine after the fact, a piece of a criminal case. So there are lots of mechanisms to do it, but I think we need to do a better job of offering the support so those cases can be brought, because the last thing I've ever wanted as a prosecutor is there to be any question about the legitimacy of a conviction, because that hurts every one of us in the system.
Thank you, Ethan. We'll go on now to another question from Jason Jones.
How can restorative justice exist with the existing framework of the criminal justice system?
Mike, can you answer that question from Jason?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because really our entire system of justice is set up to do the opposite of what the restorative philosophy would have us do, which is to bring somebody, the person who caused harm, and hold them accountable and make them a part of the process, hopefully in the healing of the victim. Everything in our criminal justice system is designed to keep people separate, to keep them apart. So, I think it really is going to be a challenge. There's the extrajudicial ways, just working outside the system, where a district attorney could say by policy that there are certain types of cases or crimes that they would be willing to handle in a restorative manner or framework outside the criminal justice system. And, you would put up policies around that in terms of, talking with the victim, making sure that they are on board with that. Because ultimately, I think the restorative piece has to be the focus, and that's restoring the victim and helping them heal. So you want to make sure that the victim would be on board with that type of a process, and then handling it outside of the criminal justice system would be one way. Inside the criminal justice system, I've talked with district attorneys. I spoke with a DA, in an elected DA in a different state, who actually did build restorative justice into his office, into his agency, people that could practice that and be the actual people who engage with both the victim and the defendant. I'm ultimately not convinced that that's necessarily the best way to go about it. It's something I would learn more about, but I actually think that having the professionals doing the restorative work outside of the district attorney's office is probably the best way to go about it. So there's the extrajudicial way. And then there is just, once somebody is sentenced, a lot of times, especially for some of the more heinous crimes in our system, and I've talked to people who have been victims of their family members have been murdered. And there's a judge over in Washington County, Judge Tom Cole, whose daughter was a murder victim. And, he decided that he did want to engage at some point, and he's a very religious man. And so he came at it from a religious perspective, but he kind of made that connection with the person who murdered his daughter and got what he wanted to do in terms of healing from that process. So there are ways that it can be done, but that was very initiated by Judge Cole. I think building up avenues to make that available, because sometimes, when we're dealing with the case, it's too fresh, it's too early to go into a more restorative process. But at some point, the victim might decide that's what they would like to do, and we should help build resources so they can do that.
Thanks, Mike. Ethan, would you answer the same question?
Well, I think Mike appropriately gets at the fact that there are some ways in which it's a tough fit with the existing system. But I guess I'll approach it from the perspective of, there are some contours to our system that are not going to change so long as we have the U.S. Constitution and a framework that's set up. And so, having said that, really the question, as I see it, is, what can we do to make it work? And there are things, there are things that I think are not mutually exclusive with the existing framework we have and the existing system we have. And it really, to me, gets back to what I alluded to before, which is sort of a temporal expansion of, how do we involve the restorative process at different points in the system that we don't have right now. And that may be extrajudicial, is the way Mike described it. but it can be done. And, I think, when I talk to people about this concept, and as I said before, I can articulate generally what it is now, but for years I didn't really know what it was, even though I worked in the system. A lot of prosecutors I talk to, they're amenable to it. It's not something people say, well, that's a bad idea. And particularly if it supplements or augments what's already in the system, for a lot of them, it is simply like, how do I fit this into a system and a practice that's rigid and I have, limited resources to begin with. So it gets us back to how do we involve other stakeholders in the restorative justice process? Our victims advocates and our defense attorneys in some ways are two of the best avenues to expand that, because of course, you need to have the defendant at the table for the restorative process, and prosecutors can initiate that. And for the victims advocates whose work often goes unheralded and is misunderstood, they have a better understanding of the needs issue that, we often fail to recognize. And I speak as a prosecutor, you intellectually know the needs, but, the key piece of, restoration and the restorative justice piece is addressing those needs, and those victims advocates have their finger on the pulse of the emotional needs there. So to me, it's, again, involving other stakeholders who are in the criminal justice system, in the litigation process, at different points in the process, from involving officers earlier on, and then having folks more active when Department of Corrections is involved. That's what you need to do. And it's a heavy lift. And Mike alluded to the resource issue earlier. It's no doubt there, but if we're committed to this, then that has to be the focus. How do we make it work with what we have? Because that is the most practical way I see to making this a reality.
Thanks, Ethan. We'll hear one more question from the public, from Twana Sanchez, Oregon House Representative, and then we're going to hear the statements from both campaigns, both candidates' supporters.
Going forward at this moment in time and looking at the numbers of people that we have in our criminal justice system, in our Department of Corrections, that are alcohol and drug related and or mental health related issues, those folks that have those issues, how would we do this differently?
Mike, can you answer Tanya?
Yeah, I think we should be rethinking about how we're doing this thing and where we've gotten to where we are. I was privileged to go to Norway and tour their prison system. Norway is a country that's actually relatively similar in size to Portland or to Oregon, about I think 4.8 million people or so, and we're over 4 million in the state of Oregon. So very similar size. But where we have, I think, 14,500 or so people in prison, they have about 2,500 people in prison. So it can be done. We see in Norway and other examples across the entire world that other communities do not rely on incarceration the way that we do, and they're just as safe, if not safer, than we are. The United States is a real outlier in how much incarceration we use. So I think, we have to have brave and hard and challenging conversations because, quite frankly, and the representative's right, when you look at who's in our prisons, addiction is a main driver, mental illness is a main driver, trauma, domestic violence are drivers of people who are incarcerated. But in Oregon, a lot of the people who are incarcerated, and in fact, about half, if not more, are in there for mandatory Measure 11 crimes. And those are serious crimes. Those are not, light types of crimes. So if we really want to do something differently, we have to have brave conversations about how we are sentencing people for some of the worst crimes in our community. In Norway, it's a maximum sentence of 21 years. I'm not suggesting that that's the right answer, but I think other places have confronted this and come to drastically different conclusions than we have. So I think, restorative justice, there's an amazing book called Until We Reckon by Danielle Sered. And she talks about how restorative justice actually can hold the keys to ending mass incarceration. So I think there's promise there, and she makes a very compelling case, and from her work in Brooklyn of what she's seen possible using restorative justice on violent crimes. So in the research that she's seen in terms of their recidivism rates is extremely good and actually way better than the results that we get from our traditional incarcerative system. But we need to have a very brave conversation about how we are sentencing people in the state if we ever want to change the trajectory that we've been on in terms of how much incarceration that we use. So I think it's going to take real leadership and a lot of education and understanding and dialogue with the community if we ever want to do something different.
Thanks, Mike. Ethan,
Well,
alcohol
the
and
question
drugs.
is how we do this differently, and I think the starting point is you have to start early. I think as someone who's spent decades in the system, seen every type of criminal defendant you can imagine, this notion that the criminal justice system and incarceration exists in a vacuum is, of course, wildly off. And if you look at the history of incarceration in the United States and what's got us there between misguided policy and social policy, you can't ignore the other factors that are present. So Mike brings up Norway. That's a great example. Not the Norwegian correctional system with its sentencing cap, but you need to look at the demographics of Norway, the incidence of addiction, controlling for alcohol, but substance abuse, and mental health, single-parent households, poverty in the country of Norway. And long-term, if you track and correlate those social factors with the rates of incarceration, the type of crimes that are committed there, you see that has a big impact on who is going to prison. And so that gets us to what do we do differently in this country? The reality is we need to do a better job if we're really going to have an honest or brave discussion about incarceration. Ask ourselves, is it good that people are using methamphetamine at an early age and expect a different outcome when they're breaking into cars in their 20s? There are lots of things we need to do differently that go beyond the system that get to that ultimate question, why do we have people locked up as long as we do? There have been mistakes made, I think, long-term in this country, and thinking about incarceration as an answer to all our problems. I think if we talk about Multnomah County, and that is the office we're in fact running for, the rates of incarceration, the rates of sentencing imposition are much lower in Multnomah County than the rest of the state, as they should be in my view. And they are different than the rest of the country. In Multnomah County, and the district attorney's office has 12, I believe, alternative incarceration programs that capture many different kinds of offenses. But at the end of the day, we need to think very carefully about, causation and all of these underlying issues. So when I talk about the importance of programs, as I have throughout the campaign, they're not programs for program's sake or simply to cut the number of Department of Corrections referrals down. They are targeted addressing, the intractable, difficult issues with mental illness and addiction and folks who need services who are coming back into the community. Because until you break that cycle and get into those underlying causes, you're really not doing long-term what you would hope to do, which is put us out of business. And I think that's probably the one thing Mike and I can agree on, which is objectively the best thing that can happen is there's no more work for people like us in the prosecution business. It's aspirational and probably unrealistic, but I think if we want to look at how we get there, we need to think about all of the different causes of incarceration in our society.
Thanks, Ethan. And now we're going to hear some statements of the supporters of both candidates. And first we'll hear from Dr. Elizabeth Lottie for Ethan Knight.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Lottie. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at OHSU. It gives me great pleasure to offer my support for Ethan Knight to be our next district attorney. I've known Ethan and Elizabeth Knight for 13 years. Ethan has integrity and humor, but most importantly, he cares deeply for this community. I have followed his career closely, always wondering what might be next. I couldn't be happier to see him on the ballot. Ethan is the right candidate to improve the public safety of our community. He has spent his entire career in public service, working in our state and federal criminal courts. This hands-on experience with thousands of local residents who have come into contact with our criminal justice system has given him the insight to respond to the needs of our community. One of the things I am most impressed by is that he understands the connection between mental health, addiction, and repeated cycles of entering our criminal justice system. As healthcare professionals, we know that these underlying conditions can be much bigger determinants of whether someone reoffends than any criminal sentence. Ethan helped create the community courts here in Multnomah County that serve as alternatives for incarceration for those dealing with addiction and mental health challenges. I see firsthand how social determinants of health impact people's ability to get the compassionate care they need from all our systems. I trust Ethan to take the right approach when it comes to getting people on the better path. He's not a politician, and he's not going to be afraid to ruffle feathers if that's what it takes. It's not talked about much in this race, but the budget of the district attorney's office has been cut repeatedly over the last several years. These cuts make it harder to staff these community courts, makes it harder to give the attention to each case, and harder to determine the best course of action. Of course, all of this has taken a dramatic turn with the COVID-19 pandemic we are living through. Healthcare services are stretched thin, and forms of treatment must be adapted in the coming months to deal with the ongoing risk of spreading the virus. In this moment, we need leaders with experience to work within the system to ensure we preserve essential services and focus on what will make the biggest impact. It would be nice if we could experiment or push forward with new initiatives, but for the next few years, we simply won't have that luxury, and this is an office that isn't going to allow for on-the-job learning. We face big challenges, and I know Ethan is up to the challenge.
Great. And now we'll hear from Casey Jama from Mike Schmidt.
Hi, my name is Casey Chama. I am the Executive Director of Unite Oregon Action. For the first time, Unite Oregon Action decided to endorse political candidates. We're very excited to endorse Mike Schmidt for Multnomah County District Attorney race. Why? Because we know our criminal justice system is broken and it needs to be fixed. We need a leader with a bold, progressive ideas, and Mike is that leader. Let me give you an example. In 2017, I was part of the Attorney General's task force to end racial profiling and to fix our drug policies. As part of task force, what we needed was data and information that helped us to make the right decision. We all agreed the person we need to call was Mike Schmidt. Mike came to the meeting prepared. He came with data and facts. He showed us the data that people of color, immigrant refugees, and low-income communities are disproportionately impacted by our drug policies. And all of us who were part of the task force agreed we need to change that and we need to fix. As part of that policy, thousands of Oregonians benefited and was prevented to get convicted in felonies. That's why I'm asking you to support Mike Schmidt for Multnomah County District Attorney race. Please vote in May for Mike Schmidt for District Attorney race. Thank you.
Great. Now we'll have closing statements from both of the candidates, 3 minutes long. Can we start with Ethan Knight?
Thank you. And thank you again, Jason, and for everyone and our sponsors this evening for having us and giving us this opportunity to talk about restorative justice, but also to talk more broadly about many of these issues that Mike and I both care about and that impact our community broadly as we face the next few years in a crisis, but more importantly, in leading one of the most important offices in the community. When we started, I talked about my love of this community and how that frames my view and my vision for the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. And that's where I want to end this evening. You know, I believe very strongly there are some things we can do better. But I also know that having spent 20 years in the system, there are some things we do right and things that we need to continue to do to make the criminal justice system work for everyone. My experience and my understanding of this system has been laid out in great detail throughout this campaign, and I think is underscored by the type of support and the breadth of support I have in the legal community from our current district attorney and from those who work in the system and know in detail what it's going to entail to run this office and do it in the coming years. In talking about my vision, I believe in throughout my career, and even going back before that, that the poor in particular and people of color are disproportionately impacted by our institutions and by our criminal justice system. And I believe that we need to be fair and even-handed in addressing those inequities and disparities, not just with defendants, but victims who come through the system, who at their neediest moment and through no fault of their own need a voice. And that voice needs to be given as we deal with an increasing epidemic of low-level offenses and injustice in our system. And the only way to effectively do that is to have someone with a vision and an understanding of which low-level courts are necessary, which alternatives to treatment can be effective, and which forms of restorative justice can work within our system. And of course, that is the cause for us being here this evening. I've seen throughout my time in the system that there are opportunities to expand our understanding for victims and defendants and their families of the needs that they have and do have in the system. And I will work and continue to work to bring a restorative justice mindset, not simply the programs, but a mindset to the district attorney's office and to the deputy district attorneys who work for me in prosecuting those 10,000 crimes that we'll have to prosecute regardless. And in trying to bring that frame of mind and that mindset, I will, I believe, help lead the community in a way that's responsible and respectful of the justice system, but also builds that trust that has been lost in certain quarters of our community. So with that, I want to ask for your support and your vote on May 19th. And thank you all for your participation and thoughtful questions this evening. Thank you and good night.
Thanks, Ethan. Mike, final statement.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, and everybody who submitted questions. I think this was a good night to highlight some things that honestly, I think I started off before behind the scenes talking about this was our 8th candidates forum. And, I got some questions tonight that I haven't had yet. So I really appreciate the effort and the thought that was put into this. I started this campaign ultimately because I believe that we need major reform now in our criminal justice system. And I think now is the time and not to be scared away from that. And we're going to be facing a lot of challenges, absolutely, that we haven't been faced with before with the COVID-19 virus. But within that are opportunities. And we're already seeing this in every industry across our state and across our country, that people are adapting and we're doing things in new ways. The Multnomah County jail population is down, my understanding is at 40% right now. Well, I want to know, what is the long-term impact on crime for having 40% less incarceration in our jails? I think that we need somebody who's going to look at this not only as one of the biggest challenges, and it certainly is that, but also an opportunity to think about if the ways that we've always been doing things are the ways that we have to keep doing them. I think this has been a great campaign in a lot of ways, but we have two very different candidates in this office or for this race. One is somebody who's spent their entire career in the system. I've been out. I started in the prosecutorial system and I did that from 2007 to 2013, but I've been out since then. And I've been working with the health system, with people in our foster care system to see how we could reduce foster care reliance and looking at our addiction system and helping build coalitions and programs at the state level to start actually getting at the root causes of these crimes. I think we need somebody who has to lead this office, who has that experience of working with stakeholders outside and not just thinking that the answer to every single problem we have is a prosecutorial one, but that we need to be thinking more creatively about how we can do things differently. And quite frankly, we're going to have to do that. So I've been so honored to receive so many endorsements in this race. So many labor organizations like AFSCME and AFL-CIO and the Carpenters and the UFCW, the Grocers, but then also into communities of color, Unite Oregon, like Casey Jama, who had such great words, Apano, Latino Network, who are phone banking for me as we speak in this race, elected officials, the governor of this state, Kate Brown, former Governor Barbara Roberts and Governor Kitzhaber, This is a huge amount of a coalition that's been built. And we've been recognized now by the Mercury, the Oregonian, the Willamette Week, and the Scanner as the right candidate to take over this office. So I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that you vote for me on or before the 19th.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to you both.